Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Rich Karlgaard, who is publisher and futurist at Forbes Media. His writing is known for its keen assessment of technology, economic, business, and leadership issues. He's a regular commentator on Fox. He's a speaker, panel moderator, you name it, he does it. He's also the author of multiple books, including his latest, Late Bloomer, The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement. It's so nice to have you here, Rich.
Pleasure to be with you, Diane.
Well, I was really looking forward to this because I know you pretty well, and you were nice enough to send me an advanced copy of your book that's going to probably be published by the time this airs, called Late Bloomers, as I mentioned. And I want to get into the book, but if there's a chance on the planet that someone has not heard of you, which I can't imagine, can you just give a little bit of background as to how you got to be publisher and futurist at Forbes?
Well, yeah, thanks. It speaks to the many bountiful things that happen when you're an entrepreneur, even if you don't harvest all the gains by way of selling your stock and becoming an overnight multimillionaire. A friend and I started what became Silicon Valley's first business magazine in 1989. It was called Upside. And Upside looked at the nexus of high-tech, biotech, and venture capital, and looked at what is it like to be a venture capital-backed company? How does this work? How do the VC firms work? What is the process of going public like? And 3 years after the launch, by this time I was getting 4-hour interviews with Bill Gates and people like that.
Wow. Steve
Forbes came out to visit us in Silicon Valley with the idea of buying Upside. Well, we weren't yet profitable. Our cap table was kind of mixed up, and Steve ended up hiring me and to start a technology futurist magazine in 1992 called Forbes ASAP. And so from the get-go, I reported directly to Steve Forbes. Then I became publisher in 1998 when the previous publisher decided to go off and do a different thing.
Well, you know, I know we've been in a lot of meetings together where you've been there and Steve Forbes has been there and others, and you hang with a pretty impressive group of people, and you are, of course, at the top of the list as people I've met who really have this just the depth of knowledge, and you can just feel how smart you are when you're talking to you. And that's what was so interesting to me when I'm reading your book, of how you really are hard on yourself a lot in the book about, yeah, well, I wasn't that great in school, and I was, you know what I mean? And I love that you're so honest in the book about how you weren't always 4.0, and that there's some hope for some of us who don't necessarily hit that achievement goal that everybody thinks you have to hit at such a young age. And you start the book with a lovely story about somebody we both know, Ken Fisher. And I love the different stories you weave into your book, but I really want to start by what got you interested in writing about how we maybe put too much pressure on ourselves at a young age.
Well, sure. Just a bit about Ken Fisher. If you don't know him, Fisher Investments manages over $100 billion. You can't watch TV today without seeing an ad for Fisher Investments. And Ken talked about how he flunked out of junior college. Now, it takes some effort to flunk out of junior college, but Ken really got his act together when he was 30 years old. When I was 25 years old, Diane, I was still incapable of holding an adult-level job. I was a dishwasher, I was a temporary typist, and I was a security guard. And I remember hitting the low point when I was a security guard one night, and I had the graveyard shift at a trucking firm, and I was making my rounds, and I heard a dog barking, and I swung my flashlight around and saw that there was a Rottweiler in the yard next door. and that their security guard was a dog. So at age 25, it struck me that my professional colleague was a dog. In a couple of months, Steve Jobs, also 25, would take Apple public. And I thought, boy, I've got some ground to make up here. And and then in my late 20s, I really felt conscious of the fact that my brain, particularly the rational side of my brain, the ability to plan ahead, to think about consequences, stuff like that, began to kick in. And then I started to make pretty rapid progress in my adult life. So I had always filed that away. I knew that there was really no reason for me to bloom late other than the fact that my brain wasn't ready. Well, that was then. I think it was easier for people to have fumbling starts and make a recovery. In fact, I look back in my high school years and I see a lot of people who were screw-ups and they're doing pretty well right now. Well, I think that has become harder to do, that we put so much pressure as a society on kids, teenagers, and young adults to achieve early and big, and that this has led to this kind of madness where, we're telling kids it's all about the SAT score, it's all about the grades. The grades have to be accomplished in advanced placement courses, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're not competitive here, my God, you may not have a successful adult life. And this has just put extraordinary pressure on families. It's put extraordinary pressure on kids and teens and young adults. And it hasn't produced anything good. Somebody who is an early achiever like Mark Zuckerberg would have done it anyway. But in encouraging our kids to be like Mark Zuckerberg when their brains aren't wired that way, well, just in the past 20 years, we've had an epidemic of anxiety, depression, and suicides among teens and young adults. We have many young adults simply giving up and moving back into their parents' basements. This has led nowhere. This has led nowhere good. We have a $1.5 trillion student debt problem with an 11% annual default rate, all based on the idea that not only should everybody go to college, but everybody should go to the most elite, expensive college that can get into. And I just see that we've been caught up in a national obsession where we believe if kids don't bloom early, they're maybe not going to bloom at all. And everything about neuroscience and psychology says the opposite, that there are many decades in our lives where our true capabilities will unfold.
Well, and I did a lot of research on emotional intelligence for my dissertation. And we know, the plasticity of the brain and, what we can develop, it continues to be, important that we can develop these things as we get older. So I was really interested in the research that you had in the book. And I want to get into some of the thinking type of issues you'd address. But as you mentioned Zuckerberg, it brought to mind someone you brought up in the book as well, which is Elizabeth Holmes in the Theranos situation. Do you think that we're creating more of those problems like what she did because she wants to be the next Steve Jobs or Zuckerberg, or that we're making the people feel like they have to fake it till they make it?
Yeah, I think there's a good deal of that. I think that people draw maybe the wrong lesson from Steve Jobs. I mean, Steve Jobs was brilliant. Steve Jobs arrived at the perfect moment in time. What he was able to do was to culturally bring together the hippie movement of Northern California with the Silicon Valley ethos, and he created a kind of hippie capitalistic firm called Apple. Now, the problem with Steve Jobs is, although he did this really early, it turned out that he was a very, very flawed CEO in the beginning. And eventually he was asked, he lost a showdown with John Scully with the board of directors. And although history likes to sort of shade it in the direction of Steve Jobs, that it was Scully who drove out Steve Jobs. No, it was Steve Jobs who tried to drive out Scully, and then when that failed, he put it to a board vote, and the board voted with John Scully. Well, Steve Jobs came back in 1997, and from 1997 until his untimely death in 2011, he was a superstar CEO. And I put that down to maturity. It is the emotional intelligence that he had in his 40s and 50s that he didn't have in his 20s. It was his ability to pick really good people and stay loyal to those really good people. And that's the lesson that people should draw. I think with Elizabeth Holmes, the interesting case is, was she a born sociopath, or did she just tip that way under circumstances? And many people think that people like Elizabeth Holmes or Bertie Madoff were born that way. I think in both cases, but particularly in hers, she'd achieved so much so early academically, and she had a vision for changing the world when she was 8 years old, that when Theranos failed to meet her timetables, rather than own up to that, she got trapped in a way that Bernie Madoff got trapped. I don't think Bernie Madoff set out to screw people. I think what happened was he overpromised. He promised 1% return per month without risk. And you simply can't do that. You can't have those kind of returns without risk. So he fell behind, and then he started taking new money and paying off investors and trying to fake them out that he was still producing these kinds of returns, and he got into deeper and deeper holes and resorted to criminal behavior. I think the same thing happened with Elizabeth Holmes. So I think I see her story as tragic. I know a lot of people want to flail her now. No punishment is too much, and she deserves punishment, I think. But I think it's kind of a tragic tale of someone who believed in their own early blooming myth, and when it fell apart, they couldn't reconcile themselves with the facts.
Well, they're interesting stories, and the fact that what you said that Steve Jobs came back with a more mature outlook, and then you get the stories of Madoff and Elizabeth, and how maybe they can grow and change possibly. I don't know. I just read that Skilling's getting out and he wants to be able to do business again after Enron. Do we trust that these people are going to come back and be a Steve Jobs, or do you just kind of, where's that going to go? Can you come back and bloom after you've done something horrible?
Well, look, Mike Milken served time in prison. I think it was unfair, but he did serve time in prison. There's just no doubt about it. I think he's an example of someone who's come back and had an exemplary second act. Mm-hmm. Milken Institute does great research. The Milken Global Summit is kind of Davos West, held every year in Los Angeles. He's given hundreds of millions of dollars to cancer research. I've spent time with Mike Milken. In fact, I interviewed him on stage at a conference in Santa Monica early March, and I find him very inspirational. So it can be done. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of stories, and you have some great ones in the book. And you start, though, with childhood, which I think it's an interesting place to go back to discuss this, of how we're creating this just this need to be 4.0 perfect in these kids, and kids are being medicated for ADD 14 times more likely here than in the UK, and different things that we're doing as parents. And I meet a lot of these parents when I'm at events, the social events. They all want to tell you where their kid's going to college, which, that seems to be the topic with people that, oh, but mine's going here, but mine's going there. And it's a competition. It's a prestige. It's almost like the jewelry that they're wearing. You know what I mean? Like with designer.
Oh, yeah. And look what it led to. I mean, look at the news of a couple of weeks ago where these parents were bribing admissions directors and coaches to get their kids into schools that I think they knew these kids couldn't get into on their own. And yeah, I think the status competition is absolutely run amok to that degree. And you think about it, the prefrontal cortex of the brain isn't fully developed on average until 25. And there's a neuroscientist out of NYU named Elkanan Goldberg. He was one of my favorite finds when I was doing the research. He's in his 70s, and he feels like he's never been more creative in his life. And he set out to discover why that was. But he has this interesting theory that with each generation of, it's almost like something about our prefrontal cortex is reading the probability that we're going to live longer, at least if we take care of ourselves. And he believes the prefrontal cortex maturity onset is no longer even in the mid-20s. It's in the late 20s, and for some people in the early 30s. So that's for stars. Then the most amazing thing happens, and that is the two hemispheres of the brain after the prefrontal cortex is fully developed. Then you get this amazing flowering of neural pathways between the two sides of the brain. And as Dr. Goldberg describes it, we have more raw creative insights when we're kids and when we're teenagers and young adults than we do when we're older. But we have a higher creative yield. That is, we know how to convert these creative insights into something useful. That keeps getting better and better, because one side of the brain, the left side of the brain, perceives novel things, and then you have this back and forth communication between the left and right sides of the brain where, okay, this is novel, but how does it stack up against all these stored memories I have, and what does it really mean, et cetera, et cetera. And so our true creative years aren't over by our 20s. They only begin for many people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s.
And, I studied some of this in my research for curiosity, and I find this fascinating, everything you're talking about. I'm curious how you think the creativity factors in with the intelligence that we think we need, the IQ part versus EQ maybe, when we're trying to get into these top name schools, as we talked about. And it's interesting timing that story broke right when you were writing about this, and I'm sure everybody's calling you. So I don't want you to chime in on it, but they are trying to buy their way into these major schools. I mean, do you see? I mean, I know you went to Stanford and you have a great education and everything,
which I utterly wasted, by the way.
What you say in the book. But how do you think that you've wasted it, and how different is an education from Stanford or Harvard compared to just a regular state university?
Well, to go back on something you touched on, and then I'll get to this other part of your question.
Okay.
That to get into elite universities today, you really do have to have great SATs, you have to have great grades, and in advanced placement courses, and then you have to prove yourself exceptional in some extracurricular activity. Thus, the parents were bribing coaches to make up stories about the kids' extracurricular excellence. Right. But when you think about the SATs, I mean, the SATs capture, in a 3-hour period, they capture what you might call rapid algorithmic ability. And that's a great ability. But it's not the only ability that humans have. I mean, it's one form of intelligence among many. As you know from your research into emotional intelligence, there are all kinds of intelligences. But we have this belief that maybe 1 out of 9 or 2 out of 9 or however many forms of intelligence there are, 9, 10. I mean, I'm not that familiar with that research. I only know that there are many. But we have this idea that one is superior to all the others. And that just simply, I think, is a very narrow view of human potential. Sorry, the second part of your question was... I was
curious if you think...
Curiosity?
The same, that part, curiosity and EQ, but also education level that you're getting at these big universities as well. Are you getting?
You can get a great education. Yeah, I think at the elite universities you can get a great education, but you can also find a lesser path. I mean, when I went to Stanford had a 25% admissions rate, and they took a lot of junior college transfers because California has a great community college system. And so I was a junior college transfer from that noted Institute of Higher Learning, Bismarck Junior College in Bismarck, North Dakota. And I'm sure it was some combination of sports where the coach misread my time in an event and thought I was better than I was, and then some geographic distribution algorithm that the Stanford admissions department had, so that, hey, we need a kid from North Dakota in this year's transfer class, whatever it was. I would have loved to have taken advantage of that great lucky break. But the downside of all of these elite institutions is that it's much easier to just get by. They're smaller, you have people looking out for you. I just followed football players around at the registration line and ended up taking what was known widely in the university as the Mickey Mouse curriculum. And even with the mouse major, I was barely able to get B's.
Well, I think you're very humble because you can't possibly have not learned or gotten, had the education that you have, and been able to be an editor and all the things that you're able to do. So,
well, I tell the story in the book, and this goes to curiosity and how, when I say wasted, I wasn't really wasting time. I had this great roommate my senior year. His name was Bob, and Bob went on to be he was Phi Beta Kappa in his junior year at Stanford. He went on to Stanford Law School. He did very well. He joined the dominant firm in Silicon Valley, Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, and he had a great career. And Bob had this amazing ability to focus. He would pack up his backpack with a quart of Pepsi and notebooks and yellow highlighters and all that stuff that we used to do prior to all these electronic gadgets. And he would park himself at the study carrel, and he could study for 3 or 4 hours straight, hardcore stuff. And then he would take a break and he'd go back to his room and type up a 30-page double-spaced paper. I thought it was all in the backpack and the yellow highlighters and the Pepsi, and so I tried to do the same thing, but I would lose focus after 15 or 30 minutes, and I would head off to the library and indulge my curiosity. My curiosity happened to be Sports Illustrated, and a great magazine then. Started in 1954, but they covered everything back then, even obscure sports, and they had great writing and great photography and great illustration. And I was kind of creating this mental memory of Sports Illustrated, whether I knew it or not. And now, how could that be useful? It certainly took me away from my study, and it contributed to my barely getting passing grades, because at Stanford it was like a gentleman's C, really. And except I wasn't a gentleman at the time, but you know what I mean. It wasn't the mark of anything excellent. Years later, when my friend and I started Upside, which I mentioned, he was in charge of raising money and selling ads, and I was in charge of coming up with the product. And I thought business magazines were boring. I hadn't yet been introduced to Forbes, where I would learn otherwise, that business magazines could be cheeky and fun and punch people in the face and all that kind of stuff. So I thought, we should have a feel like Sports Illustrated. Obviously, there won't be game photography, but we could create scenes with illustration and caricature, and that's what we did. We had hired some really good writers, and we used illustration to create scenes. We had Larry Ellison of Oracle dressed up as Genghis Khan in the caricaturist's hand with severed heads at his feet. We had John Scully at Apple dressed up as Little Lord Fauntleroy getting sand kicked on him in a sandbox. And it became outrageous. And that's why people like Bill Gates gave me 4 hours of interview, because he was afraid we'd do the same to him.
Well, but as you're telling me the story of how you got into this magazine, and it was really fascinating to me to see all this, you still are at this Stanford University, and people like Bob end up at Stanford University. How much is the networking of who you're around that helps form what you're going to end up at? Isn't it still the goal to get into these places, or do you think you would have ended up at the same level if you hadn't had that experience of Stanford?
I think there's no question that as Stanford has come up in the world, Stanford in the 1970s was an up-and-coming, regionally excellent university that isn't what it is today. It's become world-class. It's become, in anybody's book, one of the top 5 universities in the world. So I have really gained by the gain in the reputation of Stanford. There are a lot of networking opportunities, but I'll tell you what I saw. I'll never forget there was a woman also in our dorms, and she had a nervous breakdown. And what caused the nervous breakdown was when we went to daylight savings time in, then it was April. And then I know you in Phoenix, you don't believe in such nonsense as daylight savings. But we went to daylight savings time, and she had a panic attack because, as she said, I lost an hour of study time when I most needed it because we had midterms coming up. Now, here was somebody who, she was in Stanford, but it actually hurt her being in Stanford. She was one of these East Coast rich kids, and she'd prepped her way and studied her way into Stanford, except when she got to Stanford, she was maybe in the 25th percentile of the students there. There were too many others that were smarter than her. And for her, that was a big deal. For me, being in the 25th percentile, I didn't even know what I didn't know. And so it didn't bother me in the same way, but it bothered her. And I think you see a lot of that, that be careful the university you pick, because you might get in and you might find that you don't thrive there. So I've become a real big believer in just taking some time out. Take 2 years after high school and go on some kind of a mission or try some entrepreneurial fling. As long as your parents are writing checks to you, there's almost no damage that you can do to yourself, and you gain a lot of maturity. Or many people, the Mormon faith, they do 2-year missions, usually between the sophomore and junior years. So when the people graduate from Brigham Young or the University of Utah or wherever these folks are, they're at 24, 25 instead of 22, and they're much more mature. So I'm also a big believer that we've done ourselves a grave injustice with this idea that everybody should go to college. Only 1 out of 20 public high schools today has what we used to call shop class. But shop class should be upgraded and modernized. And there are a lot of people that would thrive in the skilled trades. The jobs are out there. They're often 6-figure jobs, and you can go into them right away. And let's say somebody does, and they become a welder or HVAC technician or something like that. And then they decide at age 26, I really love this field, but I would love to rise. I'm now going to go back to college and become a mechanical engineer. I mean, who wouldn't want to hire somebody like that? That they understand what they're working with, and now they've got education, and they figured out a way, to go to some state college and not overspend, and so they don't have debt, and they have all this knowledge, and they're now in their late 20s. I mean, I wish there were more tracks like that. What I was hoping to do with late bloomers is really start a conversation around this, that surely there are other paths for the majority of us who don't light up the SATs and get 4.3 grade averages in advanced placement courses.
Yeah, it's such an interesting discussion, and I know you and I've had a lot of discussions about what to expect with education, with the work at Forbes School of Business, and some of the conversations you and I have had. And I also have had John Couch on my show. I don't know if you're familiar with his work at Apple, but he wrote a book about reinventing education and what, that we're spending too much time making people memorize and not really learn things. And so I was really interested in your discussions about intelligence and fluid versus crystallized. And you get into a lot of research in your book on how we think. And I know you also brought up Bandura, who was on my show a couple weeks ago, who is an amazing guy in the area of psychology. Second to Freud and famous people.
How was he, by the way? I mean, he's got to be 90 years old now.
He's going to be 94 soon.
Wow.
What a guy. He's so funny because he told me that someone interviewed him recently, and talked to him. He was so cute about this because I talked to him a few times before, at the aired episode. And I think he told it on the air as well. But he said the guy was saying, man, I can't believe no one knows who you are. I'm going to make sure and spread the word about you. And he was cute. That guy, he didn't want to embarrass him. And apparently there's some people who don't know who Bandura is. But he is such a famous name, and very interesting that you incorporated so many great names and researchers and information in your book. So that really drew
one of the things that I think we become much better at as we get older, and maybe late bloomers who don't have to protect their early success. I'm sure you're familiar with. I mean, the tree of Albert Bandura is spread widely, and Carol Dweck at Stanford, who wrote the best-selling book Mindset and teaches freshman psychology at Stanford, you could almost say fell from the Bandura tree in many ways. And when I interviewed Carol Dweck for the book, she said the freshmen she sees at Stanford today are brittle and exhausted, and they don't want to mar their perfect records. In other words, they fall right into the category she described in Mindset as people who have a fixed mindset. And when you have a fixed mindset as opposed to a growth mindset, then you don't grow. And she tells the story of John McEnroe, the tennis player who won the NCAA tennis singles as a freshman and then dropped out of college and was a sensation right away. And then he didn't get better. He didn't invest in his training. He didn't invest in his fitness, and his lesser talents, at least in the eye of McEnroe, his lesser talents began to beat him on the circuit. He didn't respond by growing. He responded by throwing tantrums of rage. And so you see a lot of that. So late bloomers have a much better ability, I believe, to see themselves objectively, what they do well, what they don't do well. And as you know, if you want to really succeed in life, if you want to succeed in a business for sure, you need to be able to find people who aren't you, who are smarter than you, and bring skills that you don't have that complement who you are. That's what Steve Jobs did so well the second time at Apple, is he brought in operational geniuses like Tim Cook, and he brought in design geniuses like Johnny Ive, and he stuck by them.
Well, yeah, and I know Keith Kroc has wrote the foreword to my book. He was a former chairman of DocuSign, and he's that kind of guy to me. He's very humble like you are. He'll say, I get these great people and have them around me. But just like you, he's super brilliant, and these guys are all brilliant, but you can't be brilliant at everything. And I think I was interested in the part in your book you got into Terman's IQ test and why that became so popular, and then the SAT test, as you mentioned before. But I found it interesting that you listed the perfect scores. How many of them got perfect SAT scores, like Gates and Bezos? And I don't even know if we had to take the SAT when I was, where I went to school. I don't even think they made you. That was only if you wanted to get into college, certain universities, right? If you went outside state, do you have to take the SAT anymore?
It's still something you should do. It gives you an edge, but I think most colleges still require the SAT or the ACT. The University of Chicago, I think, said they're not going to require it anymore, but I think that's kind of a crock, and I'm not talking about Keith Kroc. I'm talking about a crock of what, because I think if you have the ability to score stratospheric scores, you're going to do it. What I wrote the book about is why did the SAT become so prominent over time? That all the early IQ testers, and the SAT was developed by a gentleman named Carl Brigham out of Princeton in 1926. And he just saw it as a longer, more practical version of the IQ test. But all of them were wrapped up in the eugenics movement. The idea that people from Northern European countries were superior, basically, to swarthy skinned people. And it was really kind of a black mark. And Carl Brigham himself had second thoughts about the IQ test and the SAT test. And he died in 1934. He died a young man. And he said that, I believe that I have committed a grave sin in that people can be measured by one test, and it forever will predict their probabilities of success in life. And he came to realize that it was completely skewed in favor of people who grew up in the right backgrounds and so on and so forth. Just about the time the SAT might have died death because of its roots in the eugenics movement. It was given life by two left-wing reformers, the president and one of the deans of Harvard University. The incoming president of Harvard, James Conant, was not of the aristocratic class, and it outraged him that in the Great Depression, you still had some of these old money kids that were at Harvard, and they were not even coming to class. They were living in Boston, they were going to debutante balls, and they would hire tutors to push their sorry ass over the finish line during final tests. And so these two left-wing reformers thought the SAT could be a missile aimed at the aristocracy, and you could replace aristocracy with a fairer meritocracy. Conant was also on a governing board that oversaw the Manhattan Project, and whereas some of the early IQ testers with their eugenics ideas thought, one of them, I think it might have been Brigham, or one of them said, that Jewish people were inferior when it came to intelligence. Now, who would say such a thing?
Yeah.
Conant saw that the Manhattan Project, it was Jewish scientists who were fleeing Germany and Middle Europe that were the indispensable contributors to the Manhattan Project. Now, whatever you think of nuclear weaponry, it's a good thing, let us all agree, that the US got the atomic bomb before Nazi Germany did. And Hitler drove out a lot of the top scientists, for those reasons, and we were the beneficiaries of that. And Conant said, next time we might not be so lucky. So we've got to have a national testing system that can dig out who the smart people are, even if they grew up poor, even if they were whatever their racial background was, whether they were obscure farm kids. And he saw it as a weapon of national defense. And then finally, you get sort of the last leg that has really propelled the SAT and to the prominence it has. And this is my theory. And that is, you look at the wealthiest companies in the world today, the sixth wealthiest company, or the six richest companies in the United States and the world are five of them are U.S. tech companies that are fairly new. And one of them is Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company. Now, I don't know if Buffett took the SAT test, but we know that at least a co-founder, at least one of the people of the founding of Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, had perfect 800 SAT scores. And so this idea that, that's what it takes to succeed in a technology and finance-driven world. When I interviewed Bill Gates, I spent a week on the road with Gates in the early 90s. He used the term IQ all the time, as in Microsoft is the highest IQ company. That's why we're going to prevail. We have higher IQ up and down the line than Oracle does, than Sun does. And he thought that the only company in the world that competed for IQ in the same way as Microsoft was Goldman Sachs. Mm-hmm. So, here you had Gates, here you had the richest man in the world at the time saying that the key to success was having a company full of people with high IQs. And the surest way to measure that was the math portion of the SAT test.
Well, and it's interesting to look at the things that lead to success. And I love that you brought up Bill Gates, because I was going to ask you about that and how much the IQ impacted everything. And then, I had Daniel Goleman on recently, and we talked about how the impact of EQ, and then I had Francesca Gino on recently. We talked about the impact of curiosity. I'm curious what you think the impact of perception is, and when you combine all these things together, you know what I mean? How if you want to be the next Bill Gates and Bezos or anybody, maybe even not even in a unicorn company, but just like super successful, how much do we have to work on our IQ? We got to work on our EQ. Now we got to work on our curiosity. What about our perception?
Well, I think all of those matter greatly. And I think what we've done is send this message out unwittingly that only certain of these many skills really matters, because those are the skills that are going to get you into an elite university like MIT or Stanford. And then everybody who isn't there is left with this idea that they're somehow a second-class citizen. It used to be, we used to say, remember, when it was the A students would end up working for the B students? And it's kind of funny how that observation has faded away. And now we almost become A+ students, or somehow we're not going to be successful. Well, I think that all of these other skills, including emotional IQ, curiosity, perception, are hugely valuable, but we don't know how to screen for them when kids are young. And so because we can't measure them, it's like they don't even exist. And yet, Fortune, in its 2017 story on the best places to work, interviewed these enormously successful CEOs, the CEO of Intuit, the CEO of Genentech, companies like that. And they asked these CEOs, what do you most value in your employees? Since this is about the best places to work. And they all led with curiosity.
Right.
And they all talked about emotional resilience and things like that. And I just almost screamed when I read this, because I thought, well, you're sure as heck not hiring for those qualities. Are you just hoping they emerge over time? You're hiring for the same thing that everybody else of your stature, the Intuits and the Genentechs hire for, and that is, the engineer coming out of Caltech or Princeton.
Yeah, and it's not just the people they're hiring for, in my opinion, because that's one thing I talk to companies about, is how to test to the current employees to find out what's holding them back in their levels of curiosity. Because that was what I found in my research in curiosity, was there was a lot of assessments that'll tell you how curious you are or are not or whatever, but there's not anything that was telling you what was keeping you from being curious, which is what I created. And I think that, we need to find the things that are holding us back so that you can move forward. And I think that there's more that we can learn. I know, you did, I think you were talking, or you wrote about Myers-Briggs and some of the testing in there. And there's a lot of tests that maybe don't give people the answers that they're looking for. But I think anytime you can open up, you said you wanted to open up a conversation with your book. Well, I want to open up a conversation about curiosity and perception and all these things that are squishy that you get in sometimes through real world learning. And you're so humble about your education and how you weren't 4.0 and all that, but you obviously, to be an editor at Forbes and the things that you've done with, you have to be able to write and be very bright to do what you're doing. Now, if you didn't get great grades, how do you think you got to that level of ability to write? I mean, this book was so well written and so interesting and well researched. And how did you get that? Did you get that from real world learning? Did you get that from your formal education? Because you make it sound like until you were 30, you were, just a regular guy.
Well, one of the things that maybe I should have gone into in the book more than I did was that when I was a security guard, I wasn't always in a trucking yard looking straight into the eyes of a Doberman pinscher through a fence, that many of them were office jobs. I would come in at 5 o'clock and replace the receptionist, and then I would be the security guard for, until midnight, and then somebody would relieve me. Well, that was a great time to read. And I began to read things that I hadn't read before. And simply, I wasn't following any kind of a curriculum. I just read the things that interested me. But some of these people were pretty serious writers. I remember reading Saul Bellow's Humboldt's Gift, which was the novel that put Bellow over the top, and he became the Nobel Prize winner in literature a year after he published Humboldt's Gift. And I just studied these things with a fervor. I really tried to deconstruct, well, why is this such a great book on so many levels? You're going to laugh at this. You're going to think this is a made-up story. But one of the things I did well at Upside was I learned to be a really good Q&A interviewer. We didn't have a big editorial budget at Upside, and so I could fill pages with long-form Q&As. You don't see long-form Q&As today. You have podcasts instead. Mm-hmm. But guess which magazine I studied, because it was the leader in long-form Q&As? It was Playboy. And Playboy had done some great interviews. And I ended up I hired a guy who did he did the Playboy interview with Steve Jobs, and he did the Playboy interview with John Lennon that was run after Lennon's death. So he did this interview with Lennon and Yoko Ono in late 1980. Lennon was shot in December 1980. The guy's name is David Sheff, and David Sheff has subsequently had books that have made the New York Times bestseller list, a really good writer. And I knew I couldn't afford Sheff over the long term, but I wanted to get up close to Sheff to really discover how he did these great Q&As. And what I realized is that he did hours and hours of conversation and then distilled it down. And he took, there's editorial discretion when you distill it down. But his subjects didn't care because he was making them look good, but not good in a PR way. He was making them look like fully formed human beings. And, the good and the bad, but there was something about it that was very edifying to the reader and to the subject alike. They showed vulnerability. And then Sheff would always say, I always try to push people into the emotional corners. I want to see what they are like when they're angry. I want to see what they're like when they're wistful. I want to see what they're like when they're optimistic and triumphant. And he would make sure he touched all of that. And then you'd have this massive transcript that he would edit down into these great Q&As. So I thought, well, that's it. From quantity, you get quality. And I learned how to do that. And we were known at Upside for our Q&As. And once I got the ball moving on that, bang, 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 they all came. Bill Gates, Michael Dell, Scott McNeely at Sun Microsystems, folks of that caliber. And that was the thing that got Steve Forbes interested in hiring me. So anyway, I used, and probably, I should have devoted a couple of paragraphs in the book to what I learned on my own time. Maybe I'm shortchanging the reader in that sense, but you're getting an exclusive, Diane. So your listeners will know that part of the story I didn't include in the book.
And when they go around citing how Steve Jobs was impacted by learning, calligraphy for fonts, it's going to be Rich Karlgaard used Playboy. And we learned that on Dr. Diane Hamilton's radio show.
But right? I only read the interviews, Diane. I only read the interviews. I shied away from the other stuff.
Well, you had so much great stuff in the book. And there was one thing I really wanted to touch on that you said, because you asked the question, when asking how can the creative and the curious the searchers and explorers jump off the dominant culture's conveyor belt and begin to shape their own fates, or something to that effect. You said, but the answer is to quit? Is that what your answer was? And can you explain that?
Yeah, I believe that we put out the message to teenagers and kids and young adults that you should never quit, that perseverance is all. But then how do you explain Richard Branson, who has quit more businesses than he is stuck with? I mean, he quit Virgin Cola, he quit Virgin Brides. There's an optimal use of our time, treasure, and talent in any given moment in time, right? Mm-hmm. So, if you really think about that, it kind of drives you nuts a little bit, because then you're always wondering, is there a better use of my time, talent, and treasure? But why, when a military general quits, we call it a strategic retreat. When an entrepreneur goes out and tries something and then it doesn't work, the original mission in the business plan doesn't work, they don't quit. We don't think of them as quitting a business. We think of them as making an excellent strategic pivot. When Intel decided to get out of the memory chip business because Japan and South Korea were eating its lunch, and they decided to bet everything on the microprocessor, it was a very difficult decision at the time. Well, one of the founders, Bob Noyce, thought it was quitting, and Andy Grove prevailed in the argument, and the rest is history. Turned out to be a brilliant strategic retreat and refocus into something that was growing. So why can't we look at quitting in the same way? Now, I want to be very careful here. I don't want anybody to become a serial quitter. I don't want anybody to think that always quitting should be the first response to anything. But sometimes it makes sense to quit. And sometimes perseverance, if we're persevering on something that isn't coming from our own intrinsic motivation, but we feel like we're being pushed, well, that's a great prescription for burnout. that leads to that Carol Dweck observation about these kids who get into Stanford today that are brittle and exhausted because they've fulfilled somebody else's agenda. Their parents, their high school counselors, their peers, rather than doing what they should have done and driven themselves. So I think it makes sense. I think we need to look at quitting objectively and say, no, none of us should become serial quitters, default quitters when things get tough. But sometimes it makes sense. And sometimes we have to give ourselves permission to quit. Daniel J. Brown, who wrote a book that was on the bestseller list for 2 years called The Boys in the Boat, about the Depression era rowers from the University of Washington that ended up, they had a controversial coach and a boat builder, and they ended up winning the national championships in 1936. Then they went to the Berlin Olympics as an 8-man team, and they beat Germany under Hitler's nose. It was a really great story. Well, Daniel J. Brown quit high school. He was having anxiety attacks in high school, and he worked out a deal where he would study. He happened to grow up in Berkeley, and he studied at the University of California's main library, and there he fell in love with books. Later, he would quit law school. Why did he go to law school? Because his older brother had gone to law school, and his dad, while he was dying, advised Dan to go to law school too, but he hated it. He hated it. It wasn't the best use of his time, treasure, and talent, and he quit that too. And so, and what did he become? He became a junior college teacher of remedial English. It looked like he'd made a bad decision at the time, but it was his decision and he owned it. So I think that there's a case for quitting, and let's have an open and honest discussion about the virtues of quitting as well as the liabilities of quitting.
Yeah, I think it's really important because I think a lot of us who are competitive have a hard time saying they're going to quit for any reason, just because we were taught that you got to fight to the end. You know what I mean? And I think that that's a really important point. And I think that I saw some of the early reviews. I know Daniel Pink has written something very kind to say about your book, saying that our society still admires the hare more than the tortoise, but maybe that's not exactly what we're going to see in the future. And I think that it comes at a great time when there's so much talk about millennials, and if they're maybe staying home too long or doing this too much, or if we've got helicopter moms and we've got dragon mothers and we've got all these things, and you really address some really important issues. And I love that you got so much into curiosity. I wrote a lot about Carol Dweck's work in my research, so you hit on so many things that fascinated me just from my own perspective. But I know this was a really important book. I know you've written a lot of very important books, but this one really was something that I couldn't put down, and I hope everybody takes some time to check it out. As I said, it's Late Bloomers, The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement by Rich Karlgaard. So Rich, would you like to share any websites or links or anything with anybody for how they can reach you?
Sure. You can go to Late Bloomer, not plural, latebloomer.com. The book is plural, Late Bloomers, but my website is latebloomer.com. And you can go to richkarlgaard.com. And if you promise not to abuse this, just drop me an email at rkarlgaard@forbes.com. And as I said, I want to start a national conversation. This is a bit of a different book for me. I've written books on corporate culture. I've written books on high-performance teams. But this is a different book. This came from a deeper place. It certainly took more work from the time I first started jotting down some ideas until this book came out was 5 years. And a lot of research went into it. I didn't want anything in the book to not be research-based. I even had to reject a couple of ideas, things that I thought would be sure things that I wanted to write about, but I couldn't find the research to validate it. For example, is the real problem with self-doubt that it undermines our self-worth? I'm convinced that that's a problem with self-doubt, but I couldn't find that connection between self-doubt and self-worth. So I took a different approach, and that's why the chapter on how to make self-doubt your friend, using Albert Bandura's work about self-efficacy and some of the things that we know to be true there. So I made it. It was a long project, and I hope it is really useful, particularly for parents, parents who don't know whether they should be more on the tiger mom side or whether they should be more on the Montessori loose and free side. I mean, every parent is sort of racked with the sense of ever-present guilt that they're not doing exactly the right things for their kids. Well, their kids are autonomous human beings. Let them grow. Be with them for their joys and their failures. Teach them how to overcome failures. Teach them how and when to quit without becoming a serial quitter. So this is what I wanted to do at this moment in time.
Yeah, I see it for a lot of millennials too, and Gen Xers. I could see it for so many people because I had people in mind as I was reading it who I thought, oh, I got to tell this person, and a lot of them were millennials who want to do more, but now they think, everybody's kind of criticizing them that they're getting old and why haven't they done something? And I could see that this would be very helpful to them to see that it's not too late. And some Gen Xers I had in mind who stick with jobs who really aren't happy with their jobs based on the wrong reasons, maybe, because it's a fear of looking bad, quitting looks bad. And I think there's so many generational issues for each generation that I think that there, of course, it would be interesting to boomers as well, since I'm a boomer and I found it just amazing. So I think
I'll tell you what, Diane, I came away from this with a belief of a couple of things that I wouldn't have believed before.
Okay.
I will never ever use the word snowflake in association with millennials again. And I know a lot of people, and particularly conservatives, and I'm a conservative, will throw that around. When I think about what society and what parents have done to millennials, and they pushed them along this path that you shall all go to college and it's going to be the most elite college that you can get into, is it any wonder why we've created more brittle people? Because basically what some people call snowflakes, it's a cry out. And then you layer on the fact that many of these poor millennials came into the workforce after the 2008 and 2009 financial crash and recession. And, let's give them a little bit of a break and let's start a conversation that will help them. I am now rethinking my position on student loan forgiveness. I always thought that would be the worst thing. It would create a moral hazard. Nobody would ever pay off a loan again. But in my conversation with Mike Milken, he said, this is a $1.5 trillion overhang, but we are going to do multipliers of $1.5 trillion worth of damage if the 80 million millennials are not going out and starting businesses the way previous generations did, because they feel that they can't take that entrepreneurial fling because they've got debt payments. I mean, that, I don't know whether debt forgiveness, Milken said, is when I talked to him about it, he said, we let distressed companies work it out. The President of the United States has used the bankruptcy process 3 times and legally. And so why are we so demanding of these students, that they should never, that we shouldn't have a discussion about what it would mean to work out these debts. So I would have never believed that before. I became out of this a huge believer in gap years, those 2 years that you take after high school before you go to college, or maybe between college, between your sophomore and junior years. So there were a few things that really turned my mind about all of this.
Yeah, I definitely could see your point, and I got definitely different views when I was doing my research as well. And I think that especially in education, things are changing, and you can't always do things the way they were done in the past. And there's so many people out there that have all this hanging over them, and there's got to be something that makes it better, where people are going to be more productive and be able to utilize their education better and not have this burden. So I think you bring up really important points.
Both for individuals and for society. If we're going to have American society today is a little bit brittle and fragile, not unlike how Carol Dweck describes her freshman at Stanford. And if we want to see a country that is going to thrive in the future as it has in the past, then we need people to thrive. A lot of this comes from a religious belief of mine that if we were created in God's image, then you unpack that statement, then if we were created in the image of a creator, then we were born to go out and create. We were born to use whatever talents we have and marry them with our deepest passions and thrive at that intersection of our talents and passions. And those talents and passions won't always reveal themselves at age 16.
Yes.
Oftentimes they reveal themselves later, oftentimes after being beaten up. And I still think that that's the way we get the most, offer the opportunity for the most people to thrive, to live the lives that they were meant to live, to discover what Oprah Winfrey calls their supreme destiny. And society is the big winner when that happens.
And that's such a great place to end. I really think that you make so many important points, and I hope so many people will go out and get your book, Late Bloomers. So nice to have you on the show, Rich. Thank you for being on.
Thank you, Diane. This is a fascinating conversation, and your listeners got some stuff that nobody else has gotten.
That's right. We scooped them, especially on the Playboy deal. But we're good. Yeah. Thanks again, Rich.
You read it only for the interviews, Diane. The interviews.
And we will be back right after this message.